Shaquille O'Neal's large frame cast a friendly shadow as he made his way down the narrow airplane aisle. At 7 feet 1 inch tall, he was used to ducking under doorways and squeezing into spaces that weren't quite made for someone his size. But that never bothered him. He always kept his signature smile ready for anyone who recognized him. "Good morning," he said cheerfully to the flight attendant, greeting passengers at the entrance. Her name tag read James, and he returned Shaq's smile with genuine warmth. As Shaq settled into his first-class seat, he couldn't help but feel grateful. Even after years of basketball stardom and business success, he never took these comfortable flights for granted. He remembered the cramped bus rides of his early days, how his knees would ache after long trips. First class meant he could actually stretch out a little, though little was relative when you were Shaq's size. A flight attendant named Karen Matthews approached his row, pushing the drink cart. Shaq noticed something odd in her expression, a slight tightening around her eyes, a stiffness in her smile that didn't quite reach those eyes. She breezed past him to serve the businessman in the window seat. "Good morning, sir. Would you like something to drink before takeoff?" The businessman, absorbed in his laptop, barely looked up as he requested water. Karen immediately produced a bottle with a flourish and a warm smile. Shaq raised his hand politely. "Excuse me, could I get a seatbelt extender and some water too, please?" Karen's smile vanished. She looked straight through him as if he hadn't spoken at all, continuing to fuss over the businessman's tray table. Shaq blinked in surprise, but kept his composure. Maybe she hadn't heard him. "I'm sorry," he tried again, his voice gentle despite his size, "but I really do need that seatbelt extender." This time, Karen's head turned slightly. "You'll have to wait," she said curtly, her tone sharp enough to make several nearby passengers look up from their phones and magazines. Shaq sat back, his face carefully neutral, even as his mind raced. In all his years of flying, he'd encountered all sorts of people. Excited fans, nervous fellow passengers, tired crew members. But this felt different. There was something in Karen's dismissal that felt personal, intentional. A young girl sitting across the aisle with her mother watched the interaction with wide eyes. She couldn't have been more than 10, and Shaq gave her a small wave, determined not to let Karen's behavior darken the mood. The girl smiled shyly and waved back. 20 minutes passed. The drink cart moved on. Other passengers received their beverages, their snacks, their requested items. Shaq still sat without a seatbelt extender or water. The businessman next to him had already finished his bottle and received a second one with a cheerful, "Here you are, sir," from Karen. Finally, James, the friendly flight attendant from the door, passed by. Shaq quietly explained his situation, and James immediately apologized and fetched both items. As he helped Shaq with the seatbelt extender, Karen's voice carried clearly from a few rows ahead. "Some people just don't understand that first class has certain standards." The comment hung in the air like a storm cloud. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. The young girl across the aisle tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering something that made her mother's face darken with concern. Shaq took a slow, deep breath and pulled out his phone. Without drawing attention to himself, he opened his notes app and began typing. If Karen thought she could rattle him with thinly veiled prejudice, she didn't know Shaquille O'Neal very well. He'd faced down the toughest centers in NBA history. A flight attendant's bias wasn't going to break his stride. But as the plane began to taxi toward the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that this flight was about to become much more than just a trip from LA to New York. The real question was, what would he do about it? The airplane reached its cruising altitude, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Shaq continued making notes on his phone, documenting every interaction. His years of business experience had taught him the value of keeping detailed records. As he typed, he could feel the occasional glances from other passengers, some concerned, others curious, a few already pulling out their phones to record. What was happening? The young girl across the aisle was coloring in a notebook, but Shaq noticed she kept looking up whenever Karen passed by. Her mother sat straight-backed in her seat, watching everything with the sharp attention of someone who recognized injustice when she saw it. Her laptop displayed a legal document, and a business card tucked into her seat pocket identified her as Dr. Sarah Chen, civil rights attorney. Karen made her way down the aisle with the beverage cart again, this time serving hot coffee. When she reached Shaq's row, her hands seemed to develop a sudden tremor. Hot coffee sloshed over the edge of a cup, landing dangerously close to Shaq's arm on the armrest. Several drops splashed onto his expensive suit jacket. "Oh my," Karen said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "How clumsy of me. These turbulent flights, you know how it is." The plane, however, was flying smooth as glass. "No problem," Shaq responded calmly, using a napkin to dab at his jacket. "Accidents happen." His voice carried just enough weight to make it clear he knew this was no accident at all. A passenger 2 rows back had their phone held high, recording everything. Another passenger, a teenager wearing a Lakers cap, looked between Shaq and Karen with growing anger on his face. But before he could say anything, Shaq caught his eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. The teenager sat back, frustrated but understanding. The next hour brought a series of accidents and pointed comments. Karen made several announcements about maintaining first-class standards while staring directly at Shaq. When the meal service began, she somehow forgot to bring his meal until James noticed and quickly corrected the oversight. Maria, the young girl across the aisle, had stopped coloring altogether. Her small face showed confusion and distress as she watched Karen's behavior become more obvious. She tugged at her mother's sleeve again. "Mama," she whispered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Why is that lady being so mean to Shaq? He's being nice to everyone." Dr. Chen stroked her daughter's hair. "Sometimes people let fear and ignorance make them cruel, sweetheart. But watch how Mr. O'Neill is handling it, with dignity and strength." Karen overheard this exchange as she passed by. Her face flushed red, and she spun around, leaning close to Dr. Chen's seat. "I don't appreciate accusations about my service. Perhaps you'd like to file a formal complaint?" "Perhaps I would," Dr. Chen replied coolly, reaching for her briefcase. "I happen to have considerable experience with documentation of discriminatory behavior in public accommodations." The atmosphere in the first-class cabin crackled with tension. More phones appeared, recording the confrontation. James, who had been helping passengers in business class, began making his way forward, clearly aware that something was wrong. Shaq watched it all unfold, his expression thoughtful. He'd dealt with prejudice before. Everyone from his neighborhood had. But this was different. This time, he wasn't just a target. He was in a position to do something about it. Something that could make a real difference. He looked at Maria, who had torn a page from her coloring book and was drawing something new, her small face scrunched in concentration. He looked at the passengers recording everything, at Dr. Chen with her legal expertise, at James trying to maintain order. All the pieces were there for something bigger than just one bad flight experience. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, and this time, Karen really did stumble. The drink cart shuddered, and several cups tipped over. Without hesitation, Shaq reached out his long arm and steadied the cart, preventing a major spill. Karen stared at him. her mask of superiority cracking just slightly as she faced the simple kindness of the man she'd been treating so poorly. But any hope that this moment might change things vanished as Karen straightened up and announced loudly, "I don't need help from your kind." The words fell like stones in the quiet cabin. Even the businessman who had been absorbed in his laptop looked up in shock. Maria gasped. Dr. Chen started to rise from her seat. And Shaq? He just smiled, picked up his phone, and added another note to his growing documentation. Because now he knew exactly what needed to happen next. 3 hours into the flight, the temperature in the cabin had dropped noticeably. Several passengers had already wrapped themselves in the light blue blankets provided by the airline. Shaq, feeling the chill through his suit jacket, still spotted with coffee stains, pressed the call button. After a few minutes, Karen appeared, her face set in what had become a familiar mask of barely concealed hostility. "Yes?" she asked, her tone suggesting that his call was an inconvenience of cosmic proportions. "Could I get a blanket, please?" Shaq asked politely, maintaining the same calm demeanor he'd shown throughout the flight. "It's a bit cold up here." Karen's lips curved into what might have been meant as a smile, but looked more like a grimace. "I'm so sorry," she said, not sounding sorry at all. "But we're completely out of blankets. First class only receives a limited supply." As she spoke these words, Maria and her mother exchanged glances. Directly above Shaq's seat, clearly visible through the partly open overhead compartment, sat a stack of neatly folded blue blankets. Before anyone could point this out, an elderly white passenger 2 rows ahead raised his hand. "Excuse me, could I get a blanket too?" Karen's transformation was immediate and stunning. Her entire face brightened as she turned toward the man. "Of course, sir. Let me get that for you right away." She reached up to the very compartment above Shaq's seat, pulled out a blanket, and delivered it with a flourishing bow. The cabin fell silent. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines and the soft click of phone cameras capturing the moment. The elderly passenger looked from his blanket to Shaq and back again, his face reddening with embarrassment and anger as he realized what had just happened. That's when Dr. Chen stood up. "Enough," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Ms. Matthews, I've been practicing civil rights law for 15 years, and I have never seen such a blatant display of discriminatory behavior in public accommodation." Karen spun around, her face flushing. "How dare you? I'm simply doing my job, maintaining proper standards." "Your job," Dr. Chen interrupted, "is to serve all passengers equally, regardless of their race, color, or any other characteristic. I've watched you deliberately ignore Mr. O'Neill's requests, create false excuses to deny him service, and even engage in potentially dangerous behavior with hot beverages. My daughter has watched you model prejudice and discrimination instead of professional service." Maria, usually shy, suddenly stood up beside her mother. Her voice trembled slightly, but grew stronger as she spoke. "You've been mean to him all day, and he's been nothing but nice. My mom says that's what prejudice looks like, and it's wrong." Other passengers began to speak up. The teenager in the Lakers cap described how he'd been recording everything since the coffee incident. The elderly passenger tried to return his blanket, saying he wouldn't accept preferential treatment based on race. The businessman, who had been absorbed in his laptop, finally closed it and described how he'd witnessed the different treatment from the very beginning of the flight. James, the lead flight attendant, arrived quickly, his face serious as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" "What's going on?" Dr. Chen said, pulling out her phone, "is that I have documentation of multiple violations of federal aviation regulations and civil rights laws. Would you like to see the evidence?" Karen's face had gone from red to pale. "This is ridiculous. They're all conspiring against me. I've done nothing wrong." But her voice shook as she saw the number of phones pointed in her direction, capturing her every word. Shaq finally spoke, his deep voice carrying naturally through the cabin without being raised. "No one is conspiring against you, Ms. Matthews. Your own actions have spoken for themselves. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" James looked from Karen to Shaq to Dr. Chen, then at all the passengers with their phones out. His next words were measured and professional. "Ms. Matthews, please return to the galley. We'll need to discuss this situation immediately." He turned to Shaq and Dr. Chen. "I apologize for any distress this has caused. I'll need statements from everyone who witnessed these events." As Karen walked stiffly toward the back of the plane, Maria tugged at her mother's sleeve again. "Mom, is she going to get in trouble?" Dr. Chen sat down, pulling her daughter close. "This isn't about trouble, sweetheart. This is about making things right." Shaq watched the scene unfold, his mind already working on something bigger than just this one incident. He pulled out his phone one more time, but instead of adding to his notes, he opened his contacts and began scrolling through them, looking for a particular name. The hint of a smile played around his lips, the kind of smile that suggested he had a plan that would surprise everyone. James moved efficiently through the first-class cabin, speaking quietly with passengers and collecting video evidence on his tablet. The atmosphere had changed. Where there had been tension, there was now a sense of purpose. People who had been strangers just hours ago were now united in their determination to address the injustice they had witnessed. A silver-haired woman in a cardigan made her way carefully down the aisle. She carried her airline-provided blanket and stopped at Shaq's seat. "I'm Rebecca Torres," she said, holding out the blanket. "I taught elementary school for 40 years, and the most important lesson I always shared with my students was about standing up for what's right. Please, take my blanket." Shaq's face softened as he accepted the blanket. "Thank you, Ms. Torres. You must have been an amazing teacher." "Oh, I tried," she said, settling into a nearby empty seat. "But I'm still learning. Today, for instance, I learned that sometimes staying quiet in the face of wrong is the same as supporting it. I should have spoken up sooner." Other passengers began sharing their recordings with James. The teenager in the Lakers cap, whose name was Marcus, had captured nearly every interaction on his phone. "I started recording after the coffee incident," he explained. "My mom always tells me to document everything if I see something wrong going down." The businessman, who had received preferential treatment from Karen, looked deeply uncomfortable as he provided his statement. "I was focused on my work, but that's no excuse. I noticed the different treatment from the beginning and said nothing. I'm part of the problem if I just accept preferential treatment, without questioning why others are being treated worse." Meanwhile, Maria had torn another page from her notebook and was working intently on a new drawing. Her mother, Dr. Chen, was speaking with James, her legal expertise helping to frame the documentation in the most effective way. "The key here," Dr. Chen explained, "is that we have multiple witnesses and video evidence showing a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. This isn't about one isolated incident. It's about systematic mistreatment." James nodded, his professional demeanor tinged with concern. "I've been flying for 12 years, he said. "We have strict training about equal treatment of all passengers. This goes against everything we stand for as airline professionals." Anadiso, they talked. Maria finished her drawing. She walked over to Shaq, holding her artwork carefully in both hands. "I made this for you," she said shyly. Shaq took the paper with gentle hands that had once grabbed countless rebounds. On it, Maria had drawn a figure in a cape, clearly meant to be Shaq. standing tall while smaller figures gathered around. Him. The words, "Be brave, be kind," were written across the top in careful child's handwriting. "This is beautiful, Maria," Shaq said, studying the drawing. "You know what? This reminds me that sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back. It's staying strong and finding a way to make things better for everyone." The elderly passenger who had received the blanket earlier came forward. "I've sent the video of that blanket incident to my daughter. She works for a major news network. She says this kind of documentation is crucial for bringing attention to everyday discrimination." In the galley, Karen could be seen speaking frantically into a phone, her earlier confidence replaced by nervous energy. James had already radioed ahead to arrange for airline security to meet the plane, following standard protocol for serious infractions. But as Shaq looked at Maria's drawing, then at all the passengers who had chosen to stand up and speak out, a different kind of solution began to take shape in his mind. He thought about all the Karen Matthewses of the world, about how punishment alone never seemed to create real change. He pulled out his phone again and began composing an email to his business team. The subject line read, "New project proposal, Sky High Justice Initiative." "What are you thinking?" Dr. Chen asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. Shaq carefully folded Maria's drawing and tucked it into his jacket pocket, right next to his heart. "I'm thinking that maybe we have an opportunity here, not just to address one incident, but to create real, lasting change." The plane's engines changed pitch as they began their initial descent into New York. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and passengers returned to their seats. But something had changed in that cabin. They were no longer just individual travelers. They had become witnesses, advocates, and allies in something bigger than themselves. As they descended through the clouds, Shaq looked at his phone one more time, smiling at the response he'd already received to his email. Sometimes, he thought, the biggest changes start in the smallest spaces, even at 30,000 feet. As the plane touched down at JFK International Airport, everyone could see the gathering of airline officials through the windows near the Pooh gate. Their yellow vests stood out against the gray terminal walls, and among them were several people in business suits carrying tablets and looking serious. James made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an ongoing situation, we ask that you remain seated after we reach the gate. Some passengers will be asked to stay behind briefly to provide statements. We apologize for any inconvenience and thank you for your cooperation." Karen sat rigid in the jump seat during landing, her earlier superiority replaced by nervous glances toward the windows. She hadn't served anyone since being sent to the galley, and the other flight attendants had handled the final beverage service. As the plane pulled up to the gate, Dr. Chen turned to her daughter. "Maria, watching you stand up for what's right today made me so proud. You didn't just see something wrong, you spoke up about it." Maria clutched her notebook, where she'd been working on another drawing. "Is Karen going to lose her job?" she asked quietly. "I don't want her to lose her job. I just want her to be nice to everyone." Shaq, overhearing this, leaned across the aisle. "You know what, Maria? Sometimes the best way to help someone change isn't to punish them. It's to help them learn and do better. That's what my parents and coaches always taught me." The plane's door opened and airline security boarded first. They spoke briefly with James, who directed them to Karen. She was escorted off the plane first, her face hidden behind her hands. Some passengers started to record this too, but Shaq spoke up. "Maybe we could all put our phones down for this part," he suggested gently. "We've documented what matters. This moment doesn't need to follow her forever." The passengers lowered their phones, many nodding in agreement. As Karen disappeared into the terminal, airline management boarded the plane. The lead official, whose badge identified her as Director of Customer Experience, approached Shaq's seat. "Mr. O'Neill, on behalf of the airline, I want to express our deepest apologies for your experience today. We would like to take your statement, and of course, we'll fully refund your ticket." "Actually," Shaq interrupted, standing up to his full height but keeping his voice warm and inclusive, "I have a different proposal in mind, one that might help make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, on any airline." He pulled out his phone and showed her something that made her eyes widen with interest. Dr. Chen moved closer, her legal expertise already engaging with whatever Shaq was suggesting. The airline director nodded thoughtfully, then smiled. "This is unexpected, Mr. O'Neill, but I think you might be onto something significant here." As other passengers provided their statements and evidence to the airline officials, Shaq pulled Maria's drawing from his pocket and studied it again. The caped figure standing tall, surrounded by supporters. It wasn't just a child's drawing anymore. It was becoming a blueprint for something bigger. The businessman who had received preferential treatment earlier approached Shaq. "I'd like to help," he said, handing Shaq a business card that identified him as a corporate training consultant. "Whatever you're planning, if it helps prevent something like this from happening again, I want to be part of it." Ms. Torres, the retired teacher, joined them. "I have 40 years of experience teaching people to be better," she offered. "Sometimes, the hardest lessons are the most important ones to learn." Shaq looked around at this impromptu gathering of allies. The civil rights attorney, the corporate trainer, the retired teacher, the young artist, the teenage videographer, and all the other passengers who had chosen to speak up. Each one brought something unique to the table. He pulled out his phone one last time and dialed a number. When the person on the other end answered, Shaq's face broke into his famous smile. "Hey, it's Shaq. Remember that foundation we talked about starting? I think I just found our first major project. How do you feel about changing the airline industry?" He paused, listening to the response. "Yeah, I know it's ambitious, but I've got some amazing people here who want to help make it happen." As he spoke, Maria tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered something that made Dr. Chen's eyes light up. The airline director was already typing rapidly on her tablet, and James was nodding enthusiastically at whatever she was showing him. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but not in the way anyone might have expected when this flight began. Sometimes, Shaq thought, the most powerful changes come not from tearing things down, but from building something new, something that could lift everyone higher. 2 weeks after the flight, a large crowd gathered in the main conference center at JFK International Airport. Television cameras lined the back wall, and airline executives from every major carrier filled the seats. At the podium stood Shaquille O'Neal, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Maria and Dr. Chen, Ms. Torres, James, the businessman, whose name was David Mitchell, and several airline officials. Behind them hung a large banner showing a stylized figure in a cape, standing tall while others gathered around. The words, "Sky High Justice, Creating Change Together," arched across the top in bold letters. The image looked remarkably similar to a certain drawing made by a young girl on an airplane. "Today," Shaq began, his voice carrying easily through the room, "we're not here to talk about one incident or one person's actions. We're here to launch something bigger, a program that will change how airlines approach diversity, equality, and human dignity at every level." He gestured to the screen behind him, where slides began showing the details of the new initiative. The Sky High Justice program would require all airline staff to undergo comprehensive anti-discrimination training. But this wasn't just another corporate presentation to be endured and forgotten. Our program is different, Dr. Chen explained, stepping up to the microphone. It's built on real experiences and real consequences. Every training session includes actual passengers sharing their stories. Every scenario comes from documented incidents. And most importantly, it focuses not just on what not to do, but on how to actively create an inclusive environment. David Mitchell, the corporate trainer from the flight, took his turn at the podium. We've designed this program to be engaging and meaningful. Participants don't just watch videos, they engage in role-playing exercises, discuss real situations, and learn from people who've experienced discrimination firsthand. Ms. Torres stepped forward next. As an educator, I know that real learning happens when people connect emotionally with the material. That's why we're including a special component for children, teaching them early about respect, dignity, and standing up for what's right. The cameras flashed as Maria unveiled her contribution, a series of child-friendly educational materials featuring the caped figure from her original drawing. The character would guide young passengers through lessons about respect, kindness, and speaking up when they saw something wrong. But the biggest surprise came next. James stepped up to the microphone, and beside him stood Karen Matthews. When I was confronted with my actions, Karen said, her voice shaking slightly, my first instinct was to deny everything. But through this program, I've learned to face my biases and work to overcome them. Now, I'm going to help train others, sharing my story as an example of how prejudice can blind us and how we can change when we open our hearts to learning. The room fell silent. This was not the punishment many had expected or even demanded. Instead, it was an opportunity for transformation, not just for one person, but for an entire industry. Shaq returned to the podium for the final announcement. Every major airline in the United States has agreed to implement the Sky High Justice program. But we're not stopping there. We're taking this worldwide because dignity and respect know no borders. He turned to Maria, who was beaming at the sight of her artwork on the banner. Sometimes it takes a child to show us the simplest truths. That being brave and being kind can go hand in hand. That standing up doesn't mean putting others down. That real change comes when we work together. The press conference ended with another surprise, the announcement of a college scholarship fund for students who demonstrated leadership in promoting equality and justice in their communities. The first recipient? Marcus, the teenager who had documented the original incident, who planned to study civil rights law. As cameras flashed and reporters asked questions, Maria tugged at Shaq's sleeve. "See?" she whispered. "Your cape worked." Shaq looked confused. "But I'm not wearing a cape, Maria," she grinned. "Not a real one. But you turned something bad into something good. That's what superheroes do." In the months that followed, the Sky High Justice program would train thousands of airline employees. Incident reports of discrimination dropped significantly across participating airlines. Other industries began requesting similar programs. Maria's drawing became a symbol recognized throughout the travel industry, reminding everyone that change was possible when people chose to stand up, speak out, and work together. And somewhere in the sky on any given day, passengers might notice their flight attendant wearing a small pin featuring a caped figure, a reminder that true justice isn't about punishment, but about lifting everyone higher together.